Good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming tonight to the first Cornell Republicans and Cornell Review speaker event of the year. I'm so glad that we have a good turnout. Again, thank you all for coming. So just to get started with a few brief announcements while I figure out how to not hear my voice echoing through the speakers. For Cornell Republicans members, remember that we have weekly meetings. We'll have one next week. If you're a freshman, please apply for freshman representative. For members of the Cornell Review, we are having our first meeting of the year to go over programming, expectations, etc. on Thursday in Warren 151. So stay tuned for that. Additionally, in a few minutes, on the screen will be a QR code to a new Google form organizing a free speech group at Cornell that we'll get into in just a few minutes. Without any further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Robert Platt, Cornell 73, Law 76, to introduce our speaker for the evening.
Hello, Cornell. Thank you for coming tonight. I want to thank both the College Republicans and the Cornell Review and the Program on Freedom and Free Society for co-sponsoring this event. I think it's very important that we bring a lot of different voices to the campus, particularly this year of free expression. I particularly admire FIRE because to credibly defend free speech, you have to do it from both the right or the left. You can't just be selective about it. You've got to be there, do it all the time. And I've known this since I was a Cornell student. When I was a Cornell student, I was head of the local chapter of the ACLU, and then I got to be on the state board. As a result of that, I ended up serving with an obscure Columbia Law School law professor named Ruth Bader Ginsburg. It was a very memorable experience. And the most difficult thing we had to deal with at that time was the idea of, should the ACLU defend the marching of Nazis through Skokie, Illinois, which was a village that had a disproportionate number of Holocaust survivors. And even though I could really empathize, and I had many friends who lived in Skokie, I thought it was the right decision, and I've been in the same place politically ever since, determined to defend free speech from the left, the right, the center, whatever. It has an inherent value. And I particularly admire FIRE for having exactly that same attitude. And so when we come here today to celebrate Constitution Day, there's absolutely no better group than to work with FIRE to do that. But in addition to just bringing FIRE to campus, I think it's important for us to maintain more of a place to collect in the middle on behalf of free expression, academic freedom, viewpoint diversity, and due process. And for that reason, we are going to start a new group tonight, which I hope that this QR code, and if you either at home or in the audience, if you can shoot that QR code, it'll take you to a Google form where you can express your interest in joining the group. It's going to be dedicated to being completely transparent. We will be very democratic in our operation, and we all hate spam. So that's our platform for this new group. But having said that, I really want to get down to the main event of the day, which is to introduce Connor Murnane, who I've had the privilege of working closely with for 2 years now. He is currently the Director of Engagement and Mobilization for FIRE. Mr. Murnane is an expert in the field of freedom of expression, along with contemporary debates regarding the First Amendment on college campuses across the nation. Without further delay, I give you Connor Murnane.
Why'd you clap? I haven't said anything. I've never understood clapping before. What if what if this bombs?
And we boo and hiss.
Well, exactly, but you save it till the end, right? Then you have made up your mind. So, well, good evening. Thank you all for coming. Before I get started, I want to basically do the same round of thanks Bob just did. I want to thank Bob Platt, the Cornell Review, the Cornell College Republicans, and the Program on Freedom and Free Societies for providing me this awesome opportunity tonight. Like Bob said, I'm Connor Murnane, the Director of Engagement and Mobilization for FIRE. I don't know if it's up there. I can skip to the next tab if you want.
Go to the next, scroll down to the next slide. There you go. Handsome MD.
No, thank you. Anyway, so I work for FIRE. For those that do not know, FIRE is the leading defender of First Amendment rights, both on and off campus. For over 2 decades now, we've made a point of defending speech regardless of the viewpoint or identity. If expression is protected by the First Amendment, FIRE defends it, period. My department at FIRE aims to be the home base for America's free speech advocates, giving them the community, the knowledge, and the resources they need to promote a culture of free expression. We provide opportunities for free speech supporters to challenge illiberalism and promote expression through crafting petitions, open letters, aiding in the formation of various free speech groups. I'm really eager to hear what Bob has planned for this new one. We also work with sympathetic public figures to mobilize their own following, organize events, and more. For the next few minutes, I'm going to gush a little bit about the Constitution, one particular founding father individually. If any of you can guess, I'd be shocked, and the importance of free speech. After that, I'm happy to talk about whatever it is you guys want to talk about. So I guess I'll just get started. So in that scary time before the Bill of Rights, the United States had 2 main documents that outline the philosophy and theory of government. I'm sure you all know what they are, right? The Declaration and Constitution. The Declaration outlined our highest ideal of government and us as a people, right? A goal we constantly strive to achieve. We all know the words, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. It continues on, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter, abolish it, and institute a new government. So the Declaration makes it clear that there are some rights that we as a people, not just as citizens of the United States, enjoy, and that government's purpose is to secure these rights. Then if that government deviates from those lofty goals, we as a people can say, no, get your shit together. We're not going to take this anymore. So the question remained, how do you secure these rights so government cannot trample over them or ignore them? In the first try, the Articles of Confederation failed. Most of you, I hope, took a basic survey course in American history and government. The states had too much power. We couldn't pay our debts. Congress was a laughing stock. So I guess not much is different, but it was still ruled a failure. And there's a whole host of other issues I'm not going to get into. The founders admitted defeat and got back together for the Constitutional Convention, and they ended up ironing out what would form the guidelines for government. So the Declaration of Independence, like I mentioned, outlines our highest ideal. What then is the purpose of the Constitution that they crafted? Abraham Lincoln referred to the relationship between the Declaration and the Constitution as an apple of gold and a pitcher of silver. He wrote, quote, "The pitcher was made not to conceal or destroy the apple, but to adorn and preserve it. The pitcher was made for the apple, not the apple for the pitcher." In other words, the Constitution was crafted to further and advance and preserve the ideals of the Declaration. So when they were developing this pitcher of silver, I wanted to look at what went into it. And I spent a lot of time doing this in undergrad and grad school. Everyone loves to talk about, James Madison, the father of the Constitution, when discussing its development. But does anyone here know who James Madison called the penman of the Constitution? I would love an answer. Nothing? So it's Gouverneur Morris. You should all go and research Gouverneur Morris, arguably the most interesting founding father. So few at that time, and even to today, were able to simplify and explain Madison's philosophy as Gouverneur Morris. I'm going to spend the next few minutes, like I said, gushing about a particular founding father because the world needs to know. So Gouverneur Morris was a lawyer, a statesman, a disabled founding father, a big-time philanderer, and an aristocrat through and through. He championed the idea of a single union over a government of states and helped set us on the path we are today. Morris was born to the family estate Morrisania on the north side of the Harlem River, which is now part of the Bronx. His family, were wealthy landowners. The revolution caused a pretty interesting split in his family. One half brother would sign the Declaration of Independence. The other half brother was a major general in the British Army, and his grandfather was the Chief Justice of New York and a British governor of New Jersey. Morris struck quite a figure. You see him in a lot of pictures. You don't see him standing up, but his height rivaled that of George Washington. His right arm is said to have had all the skin burned off due to an accident during his collegiate years. It left much of the upper right torso unusable. In addition to that disfiguration, he had a peg leg. There are two tales that explain this injury. The first is he just had a simple carriage accident. It rolled over the leg and he had to have it amputated. And then the second one I find much more enjoyable. Legend goes that Morris had to make an unfortunate and expedient escape from the second-story window of a married woman's home who wasn't, last name Morris. In making this daring escape, his leg was fractured and he had it amputated. If you want a real cringe-inducing story of Gouverneur Morris, just look up how he died. I'm very glad for modern medicine. He would be appointed as a delegate to the Continental Congress, and he joined a committee tasked with coordinating reforms of the military. After witnessing the army encamped at Valley Forge, he was so appalled by these conditions that he became a spokesperson for the Continental Army in Congress and helped enact reforms in training, methods, and financing. He would then sign that failure of a document, the Articles of Confederation, as its youngest signer. After the Articles of Confederation failed and they wanted to do something else, Morris was invited to attend the Constitutional Convention. While there, he spoke more than anyone else. He gave 173 speeches over the course of the convention, more than second place James Wilson and third place that father of the Constitution, James Madison. And I do want to stress, Morris wasn't some shining Democratic knight. He was skeptical of the people's ability to govern themselves without proper instruction and often argued for one supreme governmental power. But the guy did get human nature. I could continue to sing praises, and I'm happy to if you want to talk after. But one of the most interesting facets of Morris's philosophy is right here. He was a key player in many of the various compromises during the convention. According to Madison's notes, amidst the many debates over how to meet the demands of Southern states, Morris found himself, quote, reduced to the dilemma of doing injustice to the Southern states or to human nature, and he must therefore do it to the former. Morris would argue that the formula for representation should be the same one as for taxation. If Southern states were allowed to count slaves in their representation, then they must also count towards their taxes. On the 3/5 compromise, Morris further delved into this hypocrisy. He is quoted saying, upon what principle is it that the slaves shall be computed in the representation? Are they men? Then make them citizens and let them vote. Are they property? Why then is no other property included? The houses in this city, Philadelphia at the time, are worth more than all the wretched slaves which cover the rice swamps of South Carolina. His masterstroke, Morris's masterstroke, would come towards the end of the convention. On September 12, 1787, a five-man team was tasked to polish and decide on the final arrangement of text in the Constitution. Morris was tasked with helping lead this committee. The Committee on Style would take about 3 days and produce the most final draft that turned the original, I think, and please don't quote me on this, I think it was an original 23 articles down to 7. And Morris's brilliance while in this position was rewriting the preamble. Historically, preambles play an important role in law and policy making. They outline the intent and purpose of a document they precede. The preamble of the United States Constitution goes a bit further than that and has arguably achieved legendary status now. So the version that was handed to the Committee on Style says, we the people of the states of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Providence Plantations, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, and it lists out the rest of the states, do ordain, declare, and establish the following Constitution. I hope you all know the difference. The major change to the language by Morris was a focus solely on we the people rather than we the people of the states, and then the why behind the Constitution. It wasn't just we are a body of states enacting this Constitution. It really became an outline of what the Constitution would do to get us to that highest ideal. And the final preamble we are happily stuck with is we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, to establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish the Constitution for the United States of America. And small tweak by Morris guaranteed the preamble's focus is much more on the democratic will and popular sovereignty, which is at the heart of the Declaration. It is the people rather than the states that are enactors of this government. Unfortunately, we have to, put Morris to the side here. While he did believe people had certain natural rights, he was opposed to including a Bill of Rights in our Constitution, or any for that matter. For him, it was, quote, the excess rather than the deficiency of laws was to be dreaded. Luckily, I think we went on to strike a pretty solid middle ground. So even though the Constitution protected and outlined the process for the people to govern themselves, Madison and company ultimately came to the realization and acceptance that, yes, we did need enumerated rights to protect the minority from tyranny of the majority and to mark a line that the government was unable to legislate over. So in 1791, our first and, in my opinion, the greatest amendment was ratified, in addition to a couple other important ones. And I do want to be clear, the First Amendment wasn't created to protect the interests of the rich and powerful, like some would argue today. After all, they're rich and powerful. They don't need a document like this. Historically, they've had their money and power to protect them. We also don't need a special right to protect the will of the majority. That's what democratic votes are for. In the end, the First Amendment is needed primarily to protect minority views, unpopular opinions, and the expression of those who wish to clash with the ruling elite. With the ratification of the First Amendment, our nation began to develop an interesting free speech culture. Unfortunately, the legal precedent didn't really start to form until the 1900s. Throughout much of the 1800s, we had a Supreme Court that was kind of hostile to many claims of free speech and assembly. If my math is correct, and I tried to do this before I got here in the Uber and I failed, I think we barely saw a double-digit number of First Amendment cases in front of the Supreme Court between 1791 and 1889. This is due mostly to the prevailing view that the Bill of Rights didn't apply to the states. Thankfully, we did start working our way toward a free speech culture. And this is something FIRE views as a set of norms that see value in curiosity, dissent, thought experimentation, debate in search of the good and true. A culture that truly values free speech doesn't shrink away when we encounter speech we disagree with. We don't seek to silence or censor our way to victory. We meet speech with more speech. We defeat ideas we oppose with better ideas, right? Ideally, this process lets us come to the best idea at the time. We saw this at the founding of our country. They had the Articles of Confederation. Nix that, we had the Constitutional Convention, and we're now, again, I'm not a math guy, I'm pretty sure we're the longest surviving constitutional republic out there. So let me jump a few years ahead to the years of Abraham Lincoln to continue this through line of a free speech culture. In 1858, Lincoln was just a lawyer who was asked to give a lecture on discoveries and inventions. He didn't think it went well, and he turned down a few future requests to do it. He wrote a letter to one of his friends who was urging him to get back on the kind of debate circuit or lecture circuit. And he said, quote, "I'm not a professional lecturer, have never got up at one lecture, and I think a rather poor one at that." It's kind of relatable being up here right now. So Lincoln would eventually give this speech again, but he tweaked it in a way that placed a premium on the idea of a culture of free expression. The topic of his speech is what invention, discovery, or innovation did the most to advance human flourishing. Lincoln was, an intellectual guy. He had a couple patents under his name, was big into this kind of, advancement, when scientific advancement can get us a little further. So in this speech, he walks through the history of man's inventions, talking about fire and clothing and the wheel and domesticating animals, steam power, before coming to speech, or as Lincoln puts it, articulating sounds off the tongue. He then combines speech with writing as, quote, "the art of communicating thoughts to the mind through the eye is the great invention of the world," he says. Lincoln takes it one step further as he begins to talk about the printing press and how words were then able to reach the masses cheaper and quicker than any other time in history. Education skyrocketed, and what this did to the average citizen was wonderful. Lincoln went on to say, quote, "they not only look upon the educated few as superior beings, but they suppose themselves to be naturally incapable of rising to equality. To emancipate the mind from this false and underestimate of itself is the great task which printing came into the world to perform. It is difficult for us now and here to conceive how strong the slavery of the mind was and how long it did of necessity take to break its shackles and get to a habit of freedom of thought established. Reading, writing, and the rapid exchange of ideas through speech freed the mind and helped equalize the masses." 2 years later, in 1860, Frederick Douglass delivered one of his finest speeches in which he continued this through line of speeches, the equalizer. The week before Douglass gave his speech titled "A Plea for Free Speech" in Boston, a meeting was scheduled to discuss how slavery should be abolished. The meeting was interrupted by a violent mob and unable to continue. Violence beat speech that day, and Douglass found this unacceptable. When Douglass took the stage the following week, he would boldly declare that, quote, "liberty is meaningless where the right to utter one's thoughts and opinions has ceased to exist." Douglass knew the danger of this mob wasn't in their disorder, but in denying their fellow citizens the right to speak. And he did what we all must do to defend free speech. He spoke up. He took the stage and declared, quote, "no right was deemed by the fathers of the government more sacred than the right of speech. It was in their eyes, as in the eyes of all thoughtful men, the great moral renovator of society and government." The great moral renovator is just such a fine line. I go back to that time and time again. Where injustice is found, speech can call it out. Where speech calls out injustice, attention is brought. It seems pretty clear to me, but I still have to go around making that argument all the time. So the 1850 to 1860, you don't think of as an interesting time for free speech philosophy, but between Lincoln's speech on inventions and innovations, Douglass, going and saying 5 years of true free speech in this country, and every slave block in the South would be gone. There's some interesting stuff there. And then across the Atlantic, John Stuart Mill is also writing at this time. So in 1859, I think, he publishes On Liberty. I urge you all to read it if you haven't. If you're just going to read, thank you. If you're just going to read a chapter, go read chapter 2. It is arguably the best defense of free speech you're going to find. So in chapter 2 of On Liberty, Mill speaks towards general ignorance. And Mill states, quote, "He who knows only his own side of the case knows little at that." Mill then walks through 3 possible outcomes of free speech. It's what is now called Mill's trident. So the first prong is you're wrong, in which case free speech is essential to allow people to correct you. And the second is you're somewhat correct, in which case you need free speech and other viewpoints to get to a perfect understanding of what the truth is. Or 3, in the unlikely event you're 100% correct, you're going to know how to argue, defend your position, and persuade others to the correct viewpoint. So all of our country's great political and social movements that would bring us closer to those, ideals of the Declaration have come out through free speech. And I'd argue it follows Mill's trident, right? We pitch an idea, put it out there, whether it's a politician, someone standing on a stage, and the people react. Do they question? Do they boo? Do they applaud before they say a word for some reason? The marketplace of ideas works. And if we jump ahead another 100 years, the same thought process is there. In one of Martin Luther King Jr.'s last speeches, he refers to the First Amendment directly. He says, quote, "All we say to America is to be true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there." Dr. King recognized that the U.S. uniquely enshrined certain principles above all. He calls the actors entrusted by the public to hold tight to those principles. Continuing on, he states, quote, "But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest for right. And so just as I say we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around." Speech fuels everything we do, how we develop relationships, how we persuade, how we choose who gets elected, who governs us, how we want to mold our society for the better, and more. Without speech, we're nothing. And there's nothing more important than a college campus than speech. I know I'm here at Cornell University. I'm sure you all agree it's the greatest of the Ivies, and I'll agree why I'm in this room. But forgive me for a moment. I have to quote something from Yale because I think it encapsulates the purpose of, I knew that was they're the hisses you were talking about. So just, 30 seconds and then Yale will be out of the way, I swear. So in 1974, a committee was appointed by then President Brewster Jr. in response to a faculty senate resolution requesting a commission charged with examining the conditions of free expression, peaceful dissent, mutual respect, and tolerance on Yale's campus. The final product of this committee would be known as the C. Van Woodward Report. They assert that, quote, "The primary function of a university is to discover and disseminate knowledge by means of research and teaching. To fulfill this function, a free interchange of ideas is necessary, not only within its walls, but beyond the world as well. But with the world beyond as well. It follows that the university must do everything possible to ensure within the fullest degree of intellectual freedom. The history of intellectual growth and discovery clearly demonstrates the need for unfettered freedom, the right to think the unthinkable, discuss the unmentionable, and challenge the unchallengeable. To curtail free expression strikes twice at intellectual freedom, for whoever deprives another of the right to state unpopular views necessarily also deprives the rights of others to listen to those views. That is a point Douglas made directly in his speech in Boston." The Yale report continues. "We take a chance, as the First Amendment takes a chance, when we commit ourselves to the idea that the results of free expression are to the general benefit in the long run, however unpleasant they may appear at the time. The First Amendment's risky. It means we're going to hear ideas we don't like. It means we're going to be challenged. It means we're going to be tested, and we're going to learn to think because of it. I rather live in a messy world of words than a world where I'm told what to think and what to say. I have faith in all of us to work out these complex answers just as our founders did. It was the acceptance of that messy world of words and self-government that changed the world. Gouverneur Morris knew the risks of the experiment he worked to create, and he was not shy to publicly discuss them. He was quoted saying, "In adopting the Republican form of government, I not only took it as a man does his wife, for better, for worse, but what few men do with their wives. I took it knowing all of its bad qualities." It's a great line to describe democratic governance. The United States decided that the people best suited for figuring out what is right, and the United States decided that the people were best suited for figuring out what is right, and the only way the best ideas rise to the surface was through speech. And a college is supposed to prepare you to engage in that dialogue. This campus has been a hotbed for free speech controversies in recent years, from attempts to mandate trigger warnings to shout downs. I imagine Cornell's had enough of this type of publicity, and it seems like Cornell students also agree. Every year, FIRE surveys tens of thousands of college students and ranks colleges on freedom of speech. Just a few weeks ago, we released the 2024 rankings. Cornell ranked 212 out of 248 schools. Yeah, Harvard was dead last. So if you want to kick another Ivy, you guys aren't the worst. When we asked a panel of 315 Cornell students, only 29% of them stated it is very or extremely clear that the college administration protects speech on campus. Now, thankfully, your college leadership's acting to once again try to make Cornell a model for institutions across the country. President Pollock recently unveiled a university-wide initiative to explore the theme of free expression and academic freedom throughout this academic year. In addition, she joined up with 12 other college presidents to announce the campus call for free expression. In her announcement, President Pollock stated, "Learning from difference, learning to engage with difference, and learning to communicate across differences are key parts of a Cornell education. Free expression and academic freedom are the bedrock, not just of the university, but of democracy." And she's 100% correct. And just by speaking up, I think she's taking a brilliant step forward. We see it all the time at FIRE. When students and faculty see the leaders of their schools publicly pledge to protect free expression, they feel more secure to speak their minds. It also sets a really important precedent to incoming students. Come ready to participate in the marketplace of ideas. And I was just talking to a professor here. There are some folks out there that are, skeptical that this is just a PR campaign to help weather the storm. And to a point, I get it, but I'm not willing to automatically assume bad faith. I've worked in higher ed long enough. I'm a born and raised pessimist. It's really hard to say that, but I'm going to say up here right now, I can't wait to watch and read about the various events coming up here at Cornell. There's a panel on artistic freedom. You guys are sharing looks, so I'm going to ask you some questions in a minute. There's a panel on artistic freedom happening. There's a one-act opera on Scalia and Ginsburg's relationship. I pay to watch that, I think. And then Professor Eugene Bollock, a friend and ally of FIRE, is coming next week. So Cornell is at least attempting to go above and beyond to let all of you grapple with these ideas. Now, I don't expect them to spoon feed it to you. I expect you to figure it out yourself and hold them accountable where it needs to be done, but at least give it a shot. And, they should be applauded for this to an extent. If it's done well, I'll be the first to point out where it goes wrong. So I want to challenge you all, the general, be kind, be respectful, but always meet speech with more speech. If they're giving you, the opportunity, they're giving you this programming, go attend and then write about it. Go attend and talk about it. Go convince your peers why it went well or why it didn't. It's the only way we can keep the experiment of self-government going, and speech deserves all the credit for getting us here. So, it's up to you to keep that free speech, culture, that free speech fire. I hate that pun always slips out, and I am not a fan. It's up to you guys to keep that free speech fire burning here at Cornell. And, if your speech is ever, your protected speech is ever threatened, you can call FIRE and, we got your back. So thank you for listening to me ramble for too long, and let's talk about something.
The essence of the argument, I think, and from the perspective of people making a higher education decision maker, is usually doing cost benefit analysis. Mm-hmm. And you've articulated the benefit of marketplace of ideas and free exchange of ideas. But there are some people, particularly in higher education, who argue that there are harms, that some speech that I don't consider to be hate speech is hate speech. And hate speech can be doing psychological harm. And therefore, out of the spirit of protecting people from potential harm, I must curtail speech. Could you explain what you think of as the merits or demerits of that argument?
The demerits of that argument, we're not giving students enough credit, right? Why are we shielding them from something that isn't truly going to physically hurt them? Sure, they might feel yucky on a college campus, and they should, right? You should If you go 4 years, hopefully it's only 4 years before you graduate, but if you go 4 years without ever once feeling intellectually challenged, like you are wrong somewhere, you're doing college wrong, and they're doing you a disservice. So, I don't buy the hate speech argument or that speech causes harm, but the fact that we're preventing our, next generation of leaders to, not be able to sit in a boardroom and have someone disagree with them because, we don't want to upset their feelings here is a problem. And to go one step further, at the end of the day, what is a college president's primary job? It's to raise money, right? They need to, maybe not at Cornell, but I went to Ashland University. We don't have a lot in the bank. So, President Campbell's out there fundraising all the time. So, how do you raise money the best? The status quo. You keep it chugging along, you keep grad rates looking good, you keep students looking happy, you stay out of the news. So when there is that squeaky wheel that speaks up that says, no, this is harm, or tries to shout down something, you try to appease them. And it creates this slippery slope that's got us where we are today. But coming out, making, bold statements. It's why we're such a big fan of the Chicago principles. One of the biggest indicators, at least last year, I might be a little behind in the data, but last year, one of the biggest indicators on where a school was going to rank in our rankings was the administrative support score. So we do about 6 different categories based on student responses. But if the students perceived that their administration was good and was going to defend them, that blew everything else out of the water. And, something else we see, it's not administrative punishment that students are afraid of. It's their peers, right? So why is the university, if they're not going to punish speech, but they're afraid to let people hear tough ideas? I'm going to keep talking because it gets under my skin, right? You come to college to learn. You can't learn if certain ideas are off the table because that means it's a settled issue.
Thank you. For one brief note, if you're going to ask a question, please tap the bottom of this little black communication icon, little like if the one you doesn't work, try tapping one next to you.
The thing I said about college is having money, huh?
Oh, yes.
We have tech, but we don't know how to use it.
If none of them work, then please just ask a question very loud. Thank you very much.
I can restate if needed to.
Okay, so my question is actually with regards to academic grades and penalty and just sort of academic institution influence on free speech. Because one thing that I've noticed, I went to humanities school, high school, and so even within a very, generally homogenous of, in terms of viewpoints, everybody made a point to agree with the professor or whoever was speaking, even if it was a seminar, and the point was to disagree. The point was to find your own opinions. And people, I think they go kind of their whole academic careers just thinking about how they can agree to their best marks on a test or an essay or whatever. So what do you think? Do you think that there's a balance that can be struck between, getting graded? Because I've found, certainly with having very, very oppositional ideas in English classes and humanities classes in general here, that you do get penalized for it. So even if it's not like a penalty in a sense of like the academic conduct or anything like that on your grades for somebody who has I have to keep a certain GPA to be in a program or whatever it is. Do you think that there's a balance that can be struck between being graded on ideas and trying to actually learn and engage with them properly?
So I think you're kind of asking 2 questions, right? On one hand, you're asking faculty who are grading based on viewpoint being a problem, and on the other hand, you're asking students are afraid to disagree with each other.
Not even each other all the time. I think it really is sometimes.
It's across the board, and so Fire just you guys all Barry Weiss and the Free Press. We just co-sponsored. Barry Weiss is a former New York Times columnist, pretty solid reporter. She left the Times, started this media company called the Free Press. They hosted a debate last week that Fire sponsored, and it was a fun time. And they had 4 panelists, and the debate was, has the sexual revolution failed? And it was fun, but it kind of lost the debate feel because there was a lot of, well, I agree, buts. And, so I don't know if that's a deeper cultural problem or people want to keep their social circles. We're not, we're conflating that idea of speech with harm, thinking that if we debate intellectually with someone, we're going to harm them. And we don't want to hurt our friends, right? We want to keep social standing. We want to be able to, I just watched Mean Girls the other weekend. You can't sit with us. We want to be able to sit at the table, So a university, and a good professor should be giving students the opportunity to, engage and debate in a, God, I hate the term, but in a safe space, right? Providing them the boundaries for discussion, the boundaries to, vehemently disagree with each other, but separate the idea from the person. And I think we're now in a culture where we're not separating ideas from people. Now, on that grading side, that's a much tougher one. I've always been a big fan of free speech and academic freedom. I went to a small liberal arts college and then American University. And, on paper, American University should be a terrible place for free speech. But, I was in a political communications master's program. You can't go through a program like that without wearing some of your politics on your sleeve. And I was definitely just a little further right at the time than most of my cohort. And I still had faculty members who if there was a debate on some policy just going in a circle, they'd go, Connor, what's the argument on the other side? And I thought that was such a brilliant way, let's bring the debate into the classroom, but a professor's propping it up, right? A professor's opening the door. So I never experienced that. And standing up here, like I almost said it's a shame I haven't experienced that, because I want to feel and understand it. But at the end of the day, I have a tough time not just saying that's a failure by the professor, not grading on the argument, but grading on a viewpoint. And that's not what an education should be, right? An education should train you how to argue, how to get to the truth, and how to make your, argument as clear and precise as possible. So if a professor is, going to grade you on the stance you take, but not the merits, that's a tough spot.
I've experienced it constantly. Even in school, I was way further on the right than anybody there, which is kind of impossible. But even being in that situation, I would agree with you having experience. I do think it is a failure on the professional part. So maybe we need to work on them understanding sort of their responsibilities.
Yeah, this is not something, Fire would ever say, and even I'm not gonna say I back it 100%, but there's some interesting arguments to go read about what's happening in education schools, right? The focus on various kind of pedagogy, whatever it is, how to teach instead of, the actual process of what should be done. So there's some interesting arguments and reading to be done there that is kind of causing this problem. So a lot of folks in the, higher ed reform movement, whatever you want to call it, will point to ed schools as one of the problems. I did not see who raised their hand first, so I'll just go 1, 2, 3. Okay.
So historically, my question is, what tactics has Fire found to be useful in motivating university administrations that were obstinate or unresponsive in demands to open up freedom of expression to become more arduous enforcers of freedom of speech protections? So, for example, if a university campus, in order to avoid controversy, was unwilling to crack down on a particular professor, let's say was penalizing a student for grades, or this same administration was unwilling to bring in controversial guests. So, what tactics or strategies or whatever has Fire found to be useful in shifting that administration towards being more sympathetic towards a First Amendment spirit?
So originally it was lawsuits, right? And we did a lot of lawsuits, and we've won a ton of lawsuits. And the older Fire got, the more we realized that, sure, we might have this great big stick to go knock universities around with if something happened. We didn't have, the carrot part. So over the past couple of years, even as Fire expands and hires, a ton of lawyers, I think we're over probably 50 JDs at this point. We're hiring folks like me. We have a policy reform team, which is a bunch of brilliant JDs whose whole job is to reach out to college administrations, general counsels, trustees, and engage with them before there's a problem. Because at the end of the day, no matter how hostile I think, administrations may seem, they just want the best education for the students. And when you approach them with that same, I see skeptical looks. I'm willing to keep talking about that, right? We also want the best educational environment for the students. So reaching out, saying, these are the policies, and if you were to enforce this in this way, you're going to have a serious problem, was one hand. It was another way. So, lawsuits, relationship building with general counsels, administrators. And working with students, working with faculty. You know, some of the best work that's happened on campus in the past couple of years has, you know, come directly from those constituency groups. You know, if you looked at MIT the past couple of years, they had the Dorian Abbott, you know, incident, a faculty group of, you know, 187 MIT, you know, engineering nerds put together a petition to adopt the Chicago Statement. An alumni group formed, you know, well into the thousands now with a, you know, six-figure budget, you know, all towards pushing free speech. And they did it, you know, open-handed. We just want the best educational environment on this campus. And, you know, it is just it snowballs, right? The minute you create that permission structure, you speak up. I was talking to Professor Wayne here. It's a small, three-person heterodox group, but you said yourself, the longer you guys around, the more things you do, people are slowly, you know, coming out of the woodwork and saying, you know, I kind of support that. And we see it all the time, right? And go look at the college free speech ranking data. Something like 75+% of students are reporting self-censorship for various fears, you know, but then we're not asking this question, but go look at the national support for cancel culture. No one likes it, right? People want to talk, you know, so just creating that. I think I used safe space before, creating that kind of environment where suddenly it's okay. They're not alone. You have people, you know, with each other, can do great work on a college campus. You know, I wish I had this number, but I guess, you know, easily 60-70% of those Chicago statement schools that have, you know, shifted the culture towards free speech, that didn't come from a top-down push. You know, at Ashland University, it was the student senate, faculty, you know, senates across the board. You know, Williams College, I spent a lot of time on Williams. They're a historically bad actor. It was the faculty senate that got the gall to push for the Chicago Statement. And unfortunately, it was students that shot it down, right? But it's capitalizing on those upswells and finding the people who can, you know, here's just a kind of a funny story. IRS supporters all over the place. You know, a few in Seattle, you know, name another, you know, other cities you wouldn't want to live. We hear all the time, you know, I think I'm the only fire supporter that lives in the city. And then we're like, no, you're not. We'll host a dinner. We'll get 6 or 7 of you in a room and we get them together. And now they have like their own little free speech clubs, right? But it's just showing people they're not alone and, you know, things can happen. So that was a real roundabout answer, but I hope I checked a few boxes. 1 and then 2.
Good, yeah. I have a question about fire's position on a few things like libel laws, slander laws, perhaps different things like, let's say, some of the pornographic material on billboards on their land adjacent to a highway, something like that. Also, books containing how to create crystal meth, stuff like that, how to build a bomb, different items that are necessarily freedom of expression, but not good for America.
Well, so I'm going to stop you right there, right? The question of not good for America is a tough line, right? One of our biggest issues on college campuses are speech codes that are too vague and can be arbitrarily applied. You know, we see the rational person, you know, a rational person would find this offensive or too pervasive, right? Who's a rational person? So, right, you may find that unacceptable. You know, I probably don't. Now, I've also worked really hard in my career, no offense, Bob, no offense, any aspiring lawyers, to not be one. So I'm going to, you know, point you to established case law. Book banning is a different thing. You know, you want to look at you know, how to make crystal meth. Should that be in a kindergarten library? There are reasonable mechanisms and ways to establish a kind of procedure to remove that book from a kindergarten library, as long as it's transparent and it's followed the same all the time. But a public library where marketplace of ideas should flourish, we don't want the government deciding this book is bad for America, right? Because one day it's Joe Biden, the next it's Donald Trump, and I don't want to take that gamble.
So a proponent of a crime, so it's explaining how to commit a crime, would be allowed in a public library?
Aren't there multiple books like that now? Like, If I Were to Do It, isn't that O.J. Simpson? Right? Isn't there was it a magazine or was it a book? A woman who actually murdered her husband and wrote the book on how she did it. I think she was arrested after the fact. I again, not a lawyer, don't know the specifics of the case, but it happens. And it's a messy world, right? You know, I would always, and fire would always have more speech, but there are limits, you know. True threats, right? And we know what a true threat is. Harassment, you know, severe persuasive. So, you know, go look up the Davis Standard. I'm not going to start quoting Supreme Court cases at you. So there are boundaries for, you know, First Amendment law, and they should be strengthened all the time. You know, we saw countermeasure in 303 Creative. some Colorado Supreme Court cases this year, which did kind of firm up, a few harassment and other, First Amendment law precedent. But it's relatively new. I mentioned it in my speech. There's a PBS documentary coming out. I think it's this Friday, called Speaking Freely. It's a documentary of Floyd Abrams. Floyd Abrams was involved in, you name a First Amendment case in the past 80, not 80 years, like 60 years. And Floyd Abrams was probably, on the case team. And it calls him the first First Amendment lawyer. And that might be true because it's relatively a new field. People didn't go into, First Amendment law for a long time. So, I'd go check out, I think it's called Speaking Freely, the Floyd Abrams doc. But it's a messy world, to answer your question. Porn's another one, right? Well, isn't it? You know it when you see it. So I'm not gonna comment on some hypothetical billboard, but who owns the billboard, where it is, there are a lot of things to consider there.
Okay, but is it safe to say that FIRE's position is that the First Amendment law developed in the courts should be the mechanism for drawing the line rather than people shouting at each other?
Oh, 100%, right? Yeah, 100%. We have, again, so the way I look at free speech, I'm going to break it down for you right now. We have First Amendment law, right? Boom, that's one. Exactly what you just said. Then we have a free speech culture. I outlined it. Twitter's a private company. They can boot someone off the platform. Should they? Probably not. In my own home or on my own property, I can hang whatever flag I want. Am I harassing a neighbor if I have, some porn on a flag? Oh, sorry. I like to move. Am I harassing a neighbor if I put up that billboard of porn? That's for the courts to decide. And then there's free speech decency, right? I could go home and tell my wife she looks terrible in that dress, but I'm not gonna, because I want to sleep in my bed, right? I'm not gonna go threaten people. I'm not gonna go out of my way to harass someone. And then once it goes too far, it loops right back around to that free speech law where we have the established precedent. In the back.
So my question was about safe spaces. So one of my classes, the first day, we go to some a discussion section. And we were to read a thing about free speech, like an article in the New York Times. I forget to take that author, but it's essentially on why, the definition of what a safe space is. The safe space you're mentioning is sort of a safe space for all ideas. So, but I think that becomes the idea of a safe space is up to a lot of interpretation, especially when it comes to professor, institution to institution. So there was some sort of and essentially what we were told in our stuff, from what I understood, was yes, you can say anything you want, but don't hurt somebody. Don't. There's it's a principle of reasonableness. It's very vague. So
and that's the problem,
yeah.
Right? Even if a professor outlined, here are the boundaries in my classroom, you don't know how those boundaries are going to impact someone, right? What if I'm super sensitive and that question offends me, right? This is our problem with, the reasonable person, or giving the arbitrary power to enforce restrictions to an individual, because you don't know how that individual is going to enforce these policies. So you are more likely to self-censor and chill your own speech just because you don't know, right? We see that all the time. One of our biggest issues is due process on campus. You get anonymously reported, and then you get word that there's some investigation opened up. And one of our big concerns is this person now going to shut down? Are their peers not going to talk because there's some, investigation going on? We want transparency. We want a clear process. We want due process. So, that's just another example. And safe spaces are tough. It goes back into the first question. Why are you limiting speech? Because you're worried it could cause harm. You don't know if it's going to cause harm, but by limiting speech, you're preventing advancement, you're preventing human flourishing, you're, saying there are certain things off limits, and that's a detriment, especially in a classroom.
Sort of answering, if you want to, we're talking, say you want to talk about trans, the trans people, and there's someone who identifies as a trans person who cannot in the class. And that's an interesting idea. And if you want to talk about that idea, and if you're talking about identity politics in class, and if you essentially deny that someone's identity, that brings on some sort of it is essentially you're denying who they believe themselves to be. So that how do you tackle that? Like,
it's a tricky one, right?
Yeah,
we need to create people who are, willing to not attack individuals, and it's tough when you're mixing identity with the discussion. But back to the First Amendment precedent, go look up the Davis standard, right? There are boundaries that outline that kind of harassment. Fire just did a great, actually, let me plug my company real fast. Go to the fire.org and just look up pronouns. We did a great FAQ on pronouns, mandating pronouns, at what point does not using someone's preferred pronoun become harassment? And it's going to answer a lot of your questions on that front. But it just goes back to the culture. Sure, we shouldn't attack people, right? We don't, I'm not going to come and yell at Bob because I disagree with him. I'm going to talk it out because I respect him as an individual, right? And I know his ideas aren't the entirety of who he is. And we need to instill that in the American culture again. People who can disagree and still, maybe respect's too far, but at least be willing to be in a room with someone else and not want to drown out their ideas. But, if I disagree with you, I'm going to stand up here and talk about why my ideas are better than yours. And trust me, they probably are. I'm kidding. Yeah.
One of the increasing worries I have, especially with conservative leadership on college campus, especially since Cornell isn't really a public university, is that especially after what happened at the University of Pittsburgh, security details are increasingly more expensive.
A speech tax. That's what we call it at Fire, speech tax.
So do you think there's going to be a problem in litigation because schools are just going to be like, it's not viewpoint discrimination, it's just we don't want to pay $100,000, $250,000 for security details?
That's another one where I look at it and I say, they do that, you're going to have it made because there's precedent to, back that up. It's been slapped down in court a ton of times. Fire had, we call it a speech tax, and we coined the term because we had to do a bunch of different PR campaigns on cases just like this. Bring in, pick your firebrand speaker, and then instead of your $1,000 or $2,000 event, you're being charged $40,000, and then you can't have it. And it's chilling speech because, they're now putting an undue burden on you and your club speech. So, if you want, I can send you a ton of different cases on it. That happens, the school's going to lose.
But we should say that Cornell doesn't do that, and they don't have a speech tax, and they charge you for the room, but they don't charge you for security.
Right. So Cornell covers all security details.
That's great. That's what they should do.
For speakers, but I wonder if there's a limit to that.
You'd have to ask Cornell. I can't answer that for you. All I can answer is if they start imposing undue burdens and financial restrictions on you, you guys are in the right. The precedent backs you up there. Now, I don't think it would happen. The fact that Cornell, covers security is huge. I'd love to see every college do that. And it goes back to my point, while I'm, kind of loath to go to bat for an administrator, I've found myself doing it more often than not, just because I want to give them the chance. Because it goes back to the, the point here. If I don't give someone the chance to show me who they are and talk the talk, then I'm just, blowing them off and ignoring their own speech. Okay.
Could you speak more to where your sources of confidence lie with regard to universities like Cornell adopting these policies with this year for expression? There's sincerity in doing so. I mean, we heard Paul after Dan Coulter that she basically said, I don't agree with Coulter, and it's a shame that the left has looked at the campus. And there's very little good feeling as though there's wrongdoing committed for stage.
So, but they did run the students who were identified through the judicial system.
Yeah, I don't know much about the after effect to that. So, I've been working, higher ed, free speech, academic freedom adjacent for about, 9 years now. I've yet to stumble upon a campus, whether it's Cornell, whether it's, Evergreen, that doesn't have some thriving minority, viewpoint-based student group. You guys are here. That's a testament to prove it. And for free speech's entire history, it's been a tool of minority. I'm going to UC Berkeley to talk free speech to their freshmen, I think 2 or 3 weeks. the free speech movement started at Berkeley, and it wasn't the college Republicans doing it, right? So that pendulum is always going to swing back and forth, but as long as there's a minority willing to, Push it back, it's going to keep going. So, the longer I do this, I mentioned, one person stands up and more come. I've yet to stumble my way into a campus where I've been shut down entirely. I've talked to students who say, I'd love to do this, but I'm busy, or I've talked to faculty members who, have their own concerns. But at the end of the day, there's always something there. And, look at the number of free speech alumni groups popping up, Bridge USA, Braver Angels debates, all these kind of, campus adjacent clubs that are coming. So when I see a thing like Cornell, I see Pollock slapping down the mandatory trigger warnings. There are questions about how the Coulter event was handled. You can go look at Fire's coverage. But at the end of the day, shame on you. You made us look bad is a pretty strong statement, right? So now comes right out into the year of free expression. I'm very curious. There was a lot of looks when I was talking about that and skepticism. So I'm very curious to hear, why. But take her on, face value. Why assume the worst motives? Why not give it a chance? Worst case scenario, you can go to an event and then cover it and let that, story out. But maybe she's really trying here. The campus call for free expression is another interesting one that Cornell joined. I think DePaul is a school in that. The president of DePaul University 2 years ago, DePaul came in last in Fire's college free speech rankings. And, whenever you come last in the rankings, it's a pretty rough press cycle. Harvard's experiencing it right now. I had a mobile billboard with, quote unquote, like best in education, worst in speech parked outside of their admin building for a few days. So, DePaul comes, reaches out to Fire, says, how do we change this? Right. So if the worst actor 2 years ago can now jump to the middle of the pack through, a free speech statement that isn't just a blanket, we love free speech, nothing but the speech, so help me God. It mixes in, DEI and their theory on education with free speech, but it's still damn solid. If they can do that, if they can start pushing their students into the more open direction, it should theoretically be possible anywhere. And I also trust, students who are going to get into an institution like Cornell to, call a jack and a spade a spade. I think that's been proven based on some of the coverage around. There's a real good op-ed, I forget the woman's name, Adriana maybe, in the Cornell Sun, who wrote a real interesting, defense of that education's a disruptor, and we need to preserve that disruption. So we need to lean into this, theme year for expression. So students are flaky, they're busy, but if people are going to spend the time to write something like that in the student paper, I think there's hope. If I come across a campus and it's dead, no one cares, everyone's getting a degree, going home, that's when I'm going to have a concern. Well, that's when I'm going to throw in the towel. I have some concerns today, but oh, I'm sorry, guys. Thank you.
Right. And thank you all so much for coming. So just 2 brief announcements to close it out. Again, freshman rep applications for Cornell Republicans members are due on Wednesday at midnight. And second, if you're interested in joining the Cornell Review, for those of you who are not already a member, please do come to Warren 151 at 5 o'clock on Thursday, or get in touch with me for more details. Again, thank you all so much for coming, and be sure to come to our next speaker event in 2 weeks on October 2nd, where we will gather to discuss whether or not markets are conservative. Free markets are conservative. Thank you all.